The worst nuclear disaster in the history of our planet. A huge city turned into a ghost town. In a blink. In this video, we're diving into the details of what really happened. The truth behind Chernobyl nuclear disaster. On 26th of April 1986. Exactly at 1:23 minutes and 58 seconds a.m. A routine safety test went catastrophically wrong and triggered the worst nuclear accident of all time. The incident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant near Pripyat, Ukraine, led to the release of 400 times more radiation than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. A few people died in the immediate aftermath, whilst the long-term health effects caused by Chernobyl are still a hotly debated subject. Approximately 60,000 square miles around the plant were contaminated, and an area nearly twice the city of London remains an exclusion zone to this day. Now let's compare what really happened with what we saw in the series. Did one of the firemen really pick up a piece of graphite from the core of the nuclear reactor? Yes. According to the show's writer and creator, Craig Mazin, this actually happened. A fireman picked up a piece of graphite that had come from the core of Chernobyl's reactor number 4 when it exploded. The firefighters also reportedly complained of tasting metal as they battled the fire.
It tastes metal.
The true story reveals that a few of them didn't have helmets and some of them didn't have jackets, so they were just walking around in t-shirts. According to eyewitness accounts, the red skin of some of the first responders is historically accurate. The skin either looked brown like a suntan or red like a deep sunburn. Did the men who came in close contact with the radiation begin to bleed all over their bodies? No. For example, Alexander Yevchenko, the man who props open the door to the reactor hall in the HBO miniseries, begins to bleed excessively in patches on his body. However, in exploring the truth about Chernobyl, we learned that radiation doesn't do that. If he did bleed, it would have had to have been due to thermal burns from the fires. Steam burns, or where the hot steel door came into contact with his skin. It's possible that the bleeding may be foreshadowing the severe radiation burns that over time gnawed away at the flesh on his hip, calf, left shoulder, and left arm, the areas of his body that had come into contact with the door. Implying that radiation-caused spontaneous bleeding seems to be a way to conflate the victims of the disaster with victims of war or a horror movie, only here the radiation is the enemy. Like in the miniseries, as Yevchenko wedged his body between the massive steel and concrete door to keep it open, Valery Perevochenko and 2 junior technicians went to see if they could lower the control rods into the core by hand, despite Yevchenko telling them that the rods were gone. The 3 men, who gazed into the blazing, ruined reactor for no more than a minute, had in that moment written their own death sentences. Yevchenko recalled, "They were the first to die, in the Moscow hospital." The miniseries certainly makes it seem like Yevchenko is a goner not long after the men return. However, in researching the Chernobyl true story, we learned that not only did he survive, he remained in favor of nuclear energy. Yevchenko said during a 2004 interview, "I'm fine about it. If you keep safety as your number one priority at all stages of planning and running a plant, it should be okay." A Chernobyl fact check reveals that Yevchenko indeed suffered from acute radiation syndrome, ARS. About an hour after the explosion, he began to vomit uncontrollably and his throat felt raw. At the hospital, it was calculated that he had received 410 rem. 400 rem is a lethal dose in half of those affected. The radiation had debilitating effects on his left arm, which over time was left scared and half the size of his right. He underwent numerous operations, including skin grafts, and spent a year in the hospital. Is Valery Legasov's home portrayed accurately? No. Despite the Chernobyl miniseries depicting much of the culture of the Soviet Union accurately, Valery Legasov, a member of the Academy of Sciences, would not have been living in similar squalor as a fireman in the town of Pripyat, even after Legasov was shunned by the Soviet state. This reflects the HBO series' general failure to accurately depict the significant divisions between different socioeconomic classes in the Soviet Union. Also, the real Valery Legasov was married and had children. He would have been calling home to his wife and family while he was at Chernobyl, but they're entirely omitted from the story. From various aspects of the clothing, such as the rivets in the firefighters' uniforms, to the vehicles and their license plates. The miniseries is meticulous in its historical accuracy with regard to such details, minus a few. Russians have pointed out that the glassed-in balconies and insulated dual-pane windows visible in scenes of Pripyat would not have existed there in 1986. But that's likely more a constraint of the shooting location than a deliberate error. Does the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the miniseries look like the real thing? Yes. According to New York Times science writer Henry Fountain, who has visited the Chernobyl plant, Reactor No. 4's control room in the series is historically accurate. He had visited the adjacent Unit 3 control room several years ago. He noted the show's accurate depiction of the control rod dials on the walls and the white outfits worn by the operators. Those who visit the plant today are still given the strange white coat and cap to wear as they tour the facility. In addition to the power plant itself and its workers, the firefighters' uniforms and the liquidators' homemade protective outfits were replicated to look identical to what was worn at the time. Was Valery Legasov an expert in RBMK nuclear reactors? No. Though Legasov, Jared Harris, tells Boris Sherbina, Stellan Skarsgård, this in the HBO miniseries, fact-checking Chernobyl reveals that Legasov actually wasn't an expert on Chernobyl's reactors. Legasov had been working as head of the laboratory at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. However, his specialty was inorganic chemistry, and though he was well versed in the chemistry of radioactive materials, he was not an expert on the function of the RBMK nuclear reactor. This is emphasized in the miniseries when Ulana Khomiuk, Emily Watson, steers him in the right direction at times as he works on the Chernobyl problem. Is Zharkov, the elder statesman who tells the men to contain the spread of misinformation, based on a real person? No. The Chernobyl true story exposes the fact that Donald Sumter's character, Zharkov, is fictional. In the miniseries, the elderly Bolshevik tells the men at the emergency meeting, "We seal off the city. No one leaves. And cut the phone lines. Contain the spread of misinformation. That is how we keep the people from undermining the fruits of their own labor." Though that particular speech is fiction, it's in line with the bureaucratic indirectness of Soviet speech, favoring the fruits of labor over the individuals who produce them. Not to mention the complete lack of concern for human life. How many workers and first responders died immediately following the Chernobyl disaster? In answering how accurate is Chernobyl, we learned that while the HBO miniseries makes it seem like more than a couple workers and firefighters were killed immediately. Page 66 of the official United Nations report reveals that there were only 2 Chernobyl deaths in the first several hours of the explosion, and neither of them succumbed to radiation. One of the men, Valery Kodomchuk, was the night shift pump operator and is thought to have been killed instantly by the explosion. His body was never recovered. The other lost his life as the result of burns from the fire. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that first responders and firefighters began to die from acute radiation syndrome, ARS. However, 80% of the first responders who did suffer from ARS survived. Of the first responders who did perish, 2/3 had fire burns in addition to high levels of radiation exposure, and burns were the sole cause of death in 5 of the men. This is because fire victims run an elevated risk of succumbing to infection, since the skin is the body's best defense against harmful microbes. According to page 624 of the UN report, 6 patients who did not suffer fatal skin burns survived. Of the victims, 2 were women who had been working at the plant. Is radiation really like a bullet? No. We're told this by Jared Harris's character, scientist Valery Legasov, who says that radiation is like a bullet, and Chernobyl is like 3 trillion bullets in the air, water, and food that won't stop firing for 50,000 years. It appears that science has once again gone out the window in favor of dramatization. The series is again attempting to weaponize the radiation to remind us of warfare. Radiation isn't like a bullet. If it were, we'd all be dead since we're constantly being shot by radiation bullets from cosmic rays that strike the Earth from outer space. Some of the people living at higher elevations, who are exposed to the most bullets, like residents of Colorado, actually live longer. Is Emily Watson's character, Ulana Komiuk, based on a real person? No. The HBO Chernobyl miniseries makes it seem like Valery Legasov, Jared Harris, didn't have much help as he investigated what happened at Chernobyl, except for fellow scientist Ulana Komiuk, Emily Watson. However, the real Legasov was assisted by dozens, if not hundreds of scientists who worked on the problem of Chernobyl. Emily Watson's character is fictional and was created to be an amalgamation of all of these individuals. Exploring the truth about Chernobyl led us to discover that Komiuk's actions are equally fabricated. A Soviet scientist would not have traveled to Chernobyl uninvited or took it upon themselves to investigate the accident. Nor would they have found themselves in the presence of Mikhail Gorbachev at the Kremlin not long after. Komiuk's gender, however, is somewhat realistic. The USSR had a history of training females for STEM positions. Like Valery Legasov and Ulana Komiuk in the miniseries, some of the other scientists who worked on the Chernobyl problem spoke out against the Soviet Union's official account of events. They faced similar denunciation as Legasov, in addition to arrest and imprisonment. However, they would not have been as directly defiant as Legasov and Komiuk are in the miniseries. Could a beam of blue light be seen shooting into the sky above the open reactor? Yes. Nuclear reactors can produce a blue hue from Cherenkov radiation, but that's not what caused the unique light. New York Times science writer Henry Fountain points out that there's no way it would have looked like the tribute in light in Lower Manhattan on the anniversary of September 11th. The show's creator, Craig Mazin, defended the scene by saying the beam of blue light was described by various eyewitnesses and it was essentially the ionization of the air because the radiation was so intense. Legasov also describes it this way in the miniseries. Midnight in Chernobyl author Adam Higginbotham says that engineer Alexander Yevchenko, who was on duty that night, saw the light coming up from the unshielded nuclear reactor and described it as a shimmering pillar of ethereal blue-white light, reaching straight up into the night sky, disappearing into infinity. The Chernobyl miniseries seems to adhere to the true story in its depiction of the light. During an interview at the time of the accident, Valery Legasov himself said that it made the sky turn purple. Did all of the people who watched from the railway bridge in Pripyat die? No. However, this is what has been reported in the media over the years, earning the bridge, which lies between the town of Pripyat and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, its nickname the Bridge of Death. In the miniseries, Pripyat residents gather on the bridge, which is roughly a kilometer away from the plant, to watch the clouds of smoke and rays of blue ionizing light beaming into the sky. They're covered in a cloud of radioactive ash and dust that is blowing their way. In real life, how it affected their health would have depended on how long each resident remained outside watching and how much radioactive debris was actually reaching them during that time. Today, the stories about the Bridge of Death are widely considered to be more urban legend than fact, in part perpetuated by the odd tourist industry that has sprung up in the exclusion zone. What we know from a simple Chernobyl fact check is that not every single person who watched from the bridge died from radiation poisoning. The Guardian interviewed former Pripyat resident Pasha Kondrativ in 2016. The 62-year-old said that on the day of the Chernobyl accident, he and his wife Natasha, along with daughters, Marina, 10 years old, and Tatiana, 12 years old, walked to the bridge to get a better view of the plant. I could see the ruins of the reactor. It was completely destroyed and there was a cloud of smoke coming from it. Nobody gave us any information, but we knew it was serious. We knew it was something terrifying. There are other survivors who watched from the bridge and offer similar accounts as to what they saw. Did the 3 divers who drained reactor number 4's bubbler tanks die as a result of their heroism? No, and thankfully, the miniseries clarifies this in its epilogue. Author Andrew Leatherbarrow, who spent 5 years researching the disaster for his book 1 hour 23 minutes and 40 seconds. The incredible true story of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, says that though the 3 men who drained the bubbler tanks were unbelievably heroic, they did not die within weeks from acute radiation syndrome, ARS, as was often reported in the past. According to Leatherbarrow, the events in the basement unfolded mostly like we see in the miniseries. The molten reactor core was slowly burning its way toward the giant pool of cooling water under the reactor. If the molten radioactive metal reached the water, it would have triggered a steam explosion that would have easily wiped out the entire plant, including the other 3 nuclear reactors. In the second episode, Valery Legasov, Jared Harris, and Ulana Khomiuk, Emily Watson, tell Gorbachev that this would devastate Belarus and Ukraine for hundreds of years. Nuclear energy experts agree that it would have been a bad situation, but not as bad as the miniseries would have us believe. What the miniseries gets wrong is that the 3 men did not dramatically volunteer to go under the reactor and drain the water. The 3 men were part of the plant staff and they worked in that area of the station. Oleksiy Ananenko was on shift at the time and the other 2 men, Boris Baranov and Valery Bespalov, were called in by their manager to go down and open the valves. Unlike what's seen in the miniseries, they were never offered a reward, nor were they applauded on their successful return. Like in the miniseries, the men wore wetsuits and used searchlights to find the pipe that would lead them to the valves. However, according to Oleksiy Ananenko, their faces were not covered by respirators and they didn't take oxygen tanks. They could talk to one another. They also moved more quickly than they do on the show. In researching the question, how accurate is the Chernobyl miniseries, we learned that firemen had actually drained a significant amount of the water in the basement prior to them going down. According to varying accounts, their lights really did go out. As stated at the end of the series, author Leatherbarrow confirms that none of the men died of ARS. According to his findings, shift leader Boris Baranov died of a heart attack in 2005. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If that's what happened, smash the like button and subscribe to the channel for more true stories.